Hey guys, tonight we're not just travelling back in time, we're stepping into a world where a bad harvest could land you on a burning pyre, and a neighbour's strange cat might be the last thing you ever see. We're talking about the medieval witch trials, a period so steeped in paranoia and terror that you'd probably not survive a single week. Seriously, you'd spill some milk, and someone would whisper, "She's a witch." You'd sneeze twice, and they'd say, "The devils are coming." It was a wild time, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening in, let me know where in the world you're dimming the lights and the time you're doing it. It's always cool to see. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking down a cobbled street, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. It's the late 15th century, and the world is a strange, unsettling place. The sun has set, and the only light comes from flickering torches casting long, dancing shadows that make every corner a potential hiding place for something sinister. You pull your cloak tighter, not just against the chill, but against the creeping sense of dread that hangs in the air. This feeling isn't just your imagination, it's a tangible, pervasive fear that has been carefully and meticulously cultivated, and its most potent weapon is sitting on a bookshelf in a few select homes and monasteries across Europe, a book bound in thick leather, its pages filled with the blueprint for a nightmare. This book, known as the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, isn't just a book, it's a manual, a detailed guide on how to identify, prosecute, and destroy witches. It's the kind of book you'd hope would never exist, a chilling testament to the brutal logic of its time. As you drift into the story, imagine the weight of this book. It's heavy, both in its physical form and in its influence. Written by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, it was published in 1487, and it became an absolute sensation. Think of it as the ultimate medieval self-help guide. If self-help meant how to systematically eradicate your neighbours, the book's core premise is simple. Witches are real. They are predominantly women, and they are a direct threat to the soul of Christendom. Kramer and Sprenger were obsessed, and their obsession bled onto every page, creating a terrifyingly coherent worldview where every misfortune from spoiled milk to a sick child could be attributed to a pact with the devil. Now, you might think, okay, a book, big deal. But this wasn't just any book. The printing press, a relatively new invention, allowed this venomous text to spread like a plague itself. Before this, most legal and religious texts were copied by hand, limiting their reach. The Malleus was one of the first mass-produced bestsellers, spreading its paranoia from Germany to France, Italy, and beyond. This widespread availability meant that magistrates, priests, and local officials suddenly had a go-to manual. They didn't have to rely on local folklore or their own judgment. They had an expert guide telling them exactly what to do. The book is structured into 3 parts, each more horrifying than the last. The first part is the theological justification. It's all about proving that witches are real, and that anyone who denies their existence is a heretic. Kramer and Sprenger argue that it's not just a sin to practice witchcraft, it's a sin to even doubt that it happens. They use biblical passages and philosophical arguments, twisted and bent to fit their narrative, to create a rock-solid case in the minds of their readers. They even include a famous quote, "Heresis est non credere in maleficas," which means it is heresy not to believe in witches. It's an intellectual trap, a way of silencing dissent before it can even begin. The second part is where things get truly disturbing. It's a catalogue of all the different ways witches supposedly cause harm. You'll find sections on how they can cause impotence, kill crops, summon storms, and even turn men into animals. It's a laundry list of medieval fears, all bundled together and blamed on a singular scapegoat. This part is filled with incredibly vivid, and often ridiculous, stories and examples. They talk about witches who can make a man's ahem disappear. They describe how witches use enchanted ointments to fly to their secret gatherings. It's like a deranged fantasy novel, except people were actually being tortured and killed based on these very stories. This is a fun fact for you, one you might not know. The Malleus dedicates an enormous amount of space to how witches cause impotence and sterility. This wasn't a minor point. It was a major concern for the male authors. They believed witches could bind a man's member or cause his sperm to depart from his body by magic. It's a strange, almost pathetic kind of fear, but it shows how deeply personal and misogynistic the book's concerns were. It wasn't just about theology. It was about controlling women and blaming them for everything from a bad harvest to a man's own failings. The final part of the book is the most practical and, in many ways, the most dangerous. This is the how-to guide for the witch trials. It details everything from how to conduct an interrogation to the best forms of torture. It's a step-by-step manual for the inquisitor, leaving nothing to chance. They recommend using spies to gather evidence, instructing judges on how to trick the accused into confessing, and even suggesting how to deal with stubborn witches who refuse to admit their guilt. One of the most insidious pieces of advice is about the presumption of guilt. The book essentially says that anyone accused of witchcraft is probably guilty, and the trial is just a formality to get them to confess. This brings up a fascinating point that historians still debate: just how influential was the Malleus Maleficarum. While some scholars argue it was the primary driver of the witch hunts, others suggest it was more of a symptom than a cause, reflecting the existing fears of the time rather than creating them. However, there's no denying its impact. It provided a seemingly authoritative and systematic framework that legitimized the trials and gave local authorities a tool to justify their brutal actions. It wasn't the first book on witchcraft, but it was by far the most successful and widely distributed. It normalized the idea of a widespread satanic conspiracy led by women, and in doing so, it gave permission for the worst kind of violence. The book's view of women is particularly bleak. It argues that women are naturally more susceptible to temptation and evil because of their carnal lust. It claims that a woman's physical and mental weakness makes her an easy target for the devil. This is where the misogyny is laid bare. The title itself, The Hammer of Witches, is a nod to its goal to utterly crush and destroy the female-led conspiracy they believe was plaguing the world. The authors write with a mix of genuine fear and deep-seated contempt, creating a narrative where women are not just the victims of a flawed system, but the very source of evil. As you close your eyes and let this sink in, picture a woman in a small village, maybe a midwife or a healer. She knows about herbs, can help her mother give birth, and might even be able to set a broken bone for generations. This knowledge was respected, but with the Malleus in hand, a different lens is applied. Her knowledge is no longer a gift, it's a suspicious sign. Her independence is no longer a strength, it's a challenge to male authority. Her ability to help a child or animal is now seen as a sign of a dark, supernatural pact. The book gave people a new vocabulary to express old prejudices. It turned suspicion into accusation, and accusation into a death sentence. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just a book, it was a psychological weapon. It created a feedback loop of fear and confirmation bias. Once people started believing in its theories, they began seeing witches everywhere. A cow gets sick, a witch must have cursed it. A storm destroys the crops, a witch is to blame. The book provided a convenient, albeit horrifying, explanation for all the random misfortunes of life. It's a grim reminder of how easily fear can be weaponized, and how a single text, distributed at just the right time, can help plunge an entire continent into a nightmare. This isn't just a historical footnote. It's a chilling example of what happens when superstition and paranoia are given an official, seemingly intellectual, stamp of approval, and this book, this hammer, was just the beginning of a very long, very brutal road for countless innocent people. You're still in that small village, the air growing colder as the night deepens. The fear you felt from the Malleus Maleficarum isn't an abstract concept anymore, it's a living, breathing thing. You're watching as a simple disagreement over a shared well or a patch of land can spiral into something far more sinister. It starts with whispers, with a sidelong glance, with a comment muttered just a little too loudly in the market square. It's a classic domino effect, and the first domino to fall is almost always something mundane, something entirely human. In this world, a bad harvest isn't just bad luck, it's an act of malice. Your neighbour's cow suddenly stops giving milk. It's not disease, it's a curse. A child falls ill with a fever, not a natural sickness, but the result of an evil eye. This is the reality you're navigating, where every unfortunate event is a potential piece of evidence. The logic is simple, yet devastatingly effective if something bad happened. Someone must have willed it to happen, and in the paranoid landscape of the witch hunts, that someone was often a woman who didn't fit in. The classic accusation often targeted women who were already on the fringes of society. Maybe she was a widow who lived alone, her independence making her a source of suspicion. Maybe she was a healer, her knowledge of herbs and folk remedies now viewed through the dark lens of the Malleus. Or maybe she was just outspoken, a woman who dared to argue with a man or speak her mind in a world that valued silence and subservience. Her unusual behaviour, whether it was her temperament, her appearance, or simply her solitude, was twisted and reinterpreted as a sign of her wickedness. Imagine you're this woman. You've had a minor spat with your neighbour, maybe about where your chickens are allowed to roam. A week later, their prize-winning pig dies. They remember your argument, your angry words, and the look you gave them. Suddenly, your casual disagreement is no longer just a neighbourly squabble, it's proof. The neighbour starts telling everyone who will listen about your strange behaviour, about the time they saw you walking in the woods at night. You were just gathering herbs, but they don't know that. About the way you've always seemed to know when it's going to rain. These details, completely innocent on their own, are knitted together into a damning tapestry of suspicion. This is a universal historical truth of the witch trials. The accusations rarely came from nowhere. They were almost always rooted in personal grievances, local feuds, and long-standing grudges. The witch hunts weren't some abstract theological exercise. They were intensely personal, driven by jealousy, envy, and the desire for the social control. It was a way for people to settle scores, to get rid of rivals, or to seize property. The formal legal and religious machinery of the trial simply provided a horrifyingly efficient way to do it. A peculiar detail often emerges in these accusations, the presence of witches' marks. People would claim to have seen a mark on the accused, a small mole, a birthmark, or even a scratch, which they believed was the devil's own brand. This little-known fact is particularly chilling. Special prickers or inquisitors would be called in to search the body for these marks. They believed the devil's mark was a spot on the body that felt no pain and wouldn't bleed when pricked. These prickers often used retractable needles to prove the mark was insensitive, a cruel and deceitful trick designed to ensure a confession. It's a morbidly fascinating example of how the system was rigged from the very beginning. Now, let's imagine a slightly different scenario. You are a man, a farmer. Your crops have failed for 3 consecutive years. You are desperate. Your family is starving, and your neighbours are starting to look at you with pity, or worse, contempt. You need an explanation, something to blame besides your own bad luck or poor farming techniques. You need a villain. You need someone to embody all of your misfortune. And there, living on the edge of the village, is a woman who always keeps to herself. Her name is Agnes. She's old, she's a little strange, and everyone knows she talks to her cat. You start to think, maybe she cursed my fields. The idea takes root, and it grows into an obsession. You tell your friends, you tell the local priest. The story spreads. Agnes becomes a symbol of your suffering, and your accusation is a way of regaining control over a chaotic, unpredictable world. This is a great example of the social psychology at play. The witch hunts provided a socially acceptable outlet for anxiety and fear. In a world with no real understanding of meteorology, biology, or medicine, it was a lot easier to blame a witch for a storm than to accept the randomness of nature. It gave people a sense of power over the uncontrollable elements of their lives. But this sense of power came at a terrible price. The accusations often started small, but they quickly snowballed. One person would accuse another, and under pressure, the accused would name more names to save themselves, a chilling tactic that spread the panic like wildfire. This is a point that historians often debate. To what extent did the witch hunts become a self-sustaining phenomenon, where the accusations themselves created a climate of fear that led to more accusations? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the fear create the accusations? Or did the accusations create the fear in all likelihood? It was a vicious cycle, each feeding into the other until the entire community was swept up in a storm of paranoia. You see, the initial accusation wasn't just a simple statement. It was a societal earthquake, once the words witch or sorcerer were spoken. The accused's life was over. They were immediately shunned, isolated, and their reputation was irrevocably destroyed. Their friends would turn away, their family would disown them out of fear, and they would be left to face the full, unyielding force of the legal and religious system alone. This isolation made them even more vulnerable and made it almost impossible for them to mount any kind of defense. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a small, insignificant event, a quarrel, a strange look, a dead pig could be the starting point of so much suffering. It speaks to a profound human need to find order in chaos, to find a villain for every tragedy. The medieval witch trials weren't just about religious extremism. They were about the brutal reality of human nature, about the power of gossip and the terrifying consequences of fear when it's given a formal, legal outlet. And once that first accusation was made, the journey into the darkness was swift and almost always one way. The whispers have stopped, replaced by the grim certainty of a formal accusation. You've been seized and dragged to the local magistrate, and the air is thick not with wood smoke now, but with the cold, damp chill of a stone dungeon. The fear you felt before was a creeping dread. Now it's a cold, hard knot in your stomach. Your hands are bound, your feet are shackled, and the world has shrunk to the size of a dark, cold cell. The journey from suspicion to imprisonment was swift and brutal, a one-way trip with no return ticket. And now, you're about to face the true test of your will, your faith, and your very body. You're about to enter the torture chamber. This isn't the stuff of Hollywood movies. It's a real place, designed with a terrifying efficiency to break you down, piece by piece, until the truth, or at least a truth, is forced from your lips. Remember that meticulous how-to guide, the Malleus Maleficarum. It had a whole section on this, a detailed list of methods to extract a confession. The inquisitors weren't flying blind. They had a manual, a horrifying playbook. The central belief here is that the devil has granted his followers supernatural endurance, so normal pain won't work. Therefore, the torture must be extreme. The goal isn't justice, but confession. Once you confess, the court's work is done. You've sealed your own fate, and the inquisitors can claim a victory for God and the community. The irony is staggering. They need you to confess to a crime they already believe you've committed, all while using methods that would make a saint scream out any name they wanted to hear. Let's talk about some of the tools of this gruesome trade. The rack is probably the most famous, and for good reason. It's a large wooden frame with rollers at each end. Your wrists and ankles are tied to these rollers, as the inquisitor or his assistants turn a crank. The rollers separate, stretching your body. The pain would be unimaginable, tearing your muscles and dislocating your joints. It's a slow, deliberate form of torment designed to make you choose between an excruciating, prolonged death and a quick, albeit horrifying, one on the pyre. Then there are the thumb screws and the shin vice. These were more localized, but no less brutal. Thumb screws were small metal clamps that would slowly crush your fingers. They were often used as an initial form of torture, a gentle persuasion to see if you'd confess before they brought out the heavy machinery. The shin vice was similar, but it clamped down on your shins, slowly crushing the bones and muscle. They were designed to inflict maximum pain with minimal effort, and they were a grim staple of the medieval torture chamber. This brings us to a slightly lesser-known fact about these interrogations, the psychological warfare. The torturers weren't just using physical pain. They were masters of manipulation. They would often bring in your family members, your children, and threaten to torture them in front of you if you didn't confess. They would use sleep deprivation, starve you, and keep you in a constant state of fear and confusion. They'd read passages from the Bible, twisting them to make you believe that your suffering was just, and that confessing was the only path to salvation. The whole process was designed to break not just your body, but your spirit, your mind, and your sense of self. This is a point that historians still debate. Were the torturers truly convinced that their methods were righteous, or were they simply a cynical means to an end? It's hard to say. Some likely believe they were doing God's work, saving souls by forcing them to confess their pacts with the devil. Others may have been more pragmatic, simply following a gruesome protocol to get the outcome the community demanded. In either case, the result for the accused was the same: a living hell. A fascinating and deeply disturbing aspect of this process was the search for the devil's mark. Remember this from before. The Malleus told them to look for a spot on the body that was insensitive to pain. In the torture chamber, this was taken to a whole new level. Accused witches would be stripped naked, their bodies shaved, and then systematically pricked with needles. If a spot was found that didn't bleed or react to the prick, it was considered undeniable proof. As we now know, these prickers often used needles with retractable tips, so it was almost guaranteed they'd find such a spot. It was a rigged game, a macabre magic trick played on a terrified and defenseless victim. One of the more subtle forms of torture was the vigil. The accused would be forced to stand or sit in a single, painful position for days on end, often without sleep or food. Their bodies would cramp, their minds would descend into a state of delirium, and in this fractured state, they would often begin to hallucinate and confess to anything. This method wasn't about brute force, it was about the slow, methodical erosion of the human mind. The inquisitors knew that a broken mind was far more pliable than a defiant one. The sheer cruelty of it all is a constant reminder of how a system built on fear and prejudice can warp human behavior. The people performing these acts were not necessarily sadists. They were often men who believed they were doing their duty. They were products of their time, men who had been taught that the devil was a real, tangible threat, and that a witch was a foot soldier in his army. The logic was twisted, but it was consistent. To save the community, you had to destroy the witch, and any means necessary were justified. You, in your mind, are enduring this. You've been on the rack, your fingers are bruised from the thumb screws, and you've been sitting vigil for what feels like an eternity. Your thoughts are no longer coherent. The distinction between truth and falsehood has blurred. The Inquisitor's voice is a droning hum, and the list of names they want you to give them is starting to sound like your own. You're exhausted, terrified, and in agony at this point. Confessing to a pact with the devil and flying on a broomstick to a demonic Sabbath doesn't seem any more absurd than what you're currently enduring. The confession, when it finally comes, isn't a moment of truth, it's a moment of surrender. It's a broken person giving up, a final, desperate plea for the pain to stop, and once you've confessed, the next step is inevitable. The trial is now just a formality. The inquisitors will write down your confession. You will sign it with a shaky hand, and you will be led out of the torture chamber, not to freedom, but to the pyre. The system, having done its work, can now claim a victory, and in the eyes of the community, your confession is proof that the witch hunt was justified all along, a truly brutal and tragic irony. You've confessed. The words were a jumble of pain and delirium, a desperate attempt to make the agony stop. But now they are written down. A permanent record of your guilt. The cold, hard stone of the dungeon has been replaced by the sterile, equally terrifying coldness of the courtroom. This isn't a courtroom as you know it, with a jury of your peers and the presumption of innocence. No, this is a theatre of the absurd, a performance designed not to find the truth, but to legitimize your fate. The trial itself is a stark, theatrical affair. The room is likely a grand hall or a church, filled with sombre officials and a nervous crowd of onlookers. You are brought in, your body bruised and broken, your mind a foggy mess. The judge, often an inquisitor or a local magistrate who read the Malleus Maleficarum a little too closely, presides over the proceedings with a stern, unyielding gaze. There is no defence attorney for you. No one is there to speak on your behalf, to challenge the evidence, or to question your coerced confession. The presumption of guilt is the rule here, not the exception. The court believes you are guilty from the moment you step through the door. The only question they are trying to answer is not, did you do it? But why did you do it? The trial is a public spectacle, a way of showing the community that justice is being served and that the threat of witchcraft is being taken seriously. Your confession, extracted under duress, is the star witness against you. The evidence presented against you is a bizarre collection of hearsay and circumstantial claims. Your neighbour, the one whose pig died, gets up and describes the angry look you gave them a month ago. A local child, perhaps prompted by their parents, tells a story about seeing you talking to your cat, which they now claim was a demonic familiar. The prickers, with their rigged needles, present their proof of the devil's mark on your body. Every mundane detail of your life, your solitude, your knowledge of herbs, your outspoken nature is twisted and reinterpreted as a sign of your demonic pact. This is a universal historical truth about these trials. The evidence was rarely based on facts. It was almost always based on rumours, superstitions, and personal grudges. The system was designed to make it impossible to defend yourself. How do you prove you didn't fly on a broomstick? How do you prove you didn't make a pact with the devil? The burden of proof was on you, and it was an impossible burden to bear. Any attempt to deny the charges was seen not as a sign of innocence, but as proof of your cunning and your demonic stubbornness. A curious detail often emerged in these trials, the use of a sworn-in accuser, in some cases, to add a veneer of legitimacy. A formal accuser would be appointed to present the case against you. This person was not a neutral party. They were often a local official or a cleric who was already convinced of your guilt. Their job was to compile all the whispers, rumours, and coerced confessions into a formal charge. This process gave a bureaucratic weight to the proceedings, making them seem official and fair, even though they were anything but. It's a chilling example of how the machinery of justice can be used to legitimize injustice. Historians still debate the role of the witch trial as a form of social control. Some argue that it was a way for the church and the state to enforce conformity, to punish those who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Others suggest it was a way for communities to vent their frustrations and anxieties, to find a scapegoat for their own misfortunes. The truth is likely a combination of both. The witch trials were a pressure valve for a society steeped in fear, and a powerful tool for those in authority to maintain their power. In this moment, as you stand there, battered and broken, the full weight of this system is bearing down on you. You're not a person anymore, you're a symbol. You are the witch, the devil's agent, and your punishment is meant to be a warning to everyone else. The judge, after hearing the litany of flimsy accusations and your forced confession, delivers the verdict. It's a foregone conclusion. You are found guilty. The sentence is delivered in a grave tone, but it's not a surprise. It's the pyre, the final, brutal act of this grim play. Your confession, which you hoped would bring an end to your pain, has only cemented your fate. You are to be burned at the stake. Your body consumed by fire, your soul, they hope, purified in the flames. The walk to the stake is a long, surreal procession. The crowd, a mix of the curious, the terrified, and the truly pious, lines the streets. They stare at you, some with hate, some with fear, and a few, you imagine, with a flicker of pity that they quickly suppress. You are a public spectacle, a living example of what happens when you stray from the path. You are the final, tragic star of a show that began with a whisper and will end with a scream, and as you're led to the stake, your mind can't help but return to that leather-bound book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the architect of this entire, brutal nightmare. It started with a book, and it ends with a fire. You're no longer in a damp, cold European dungeon. The chill you feel is different. It's the crisp, humid air of the American colonies in the late 17th century. The year is 1692, and the stage is set not in a grand stone cathedral, but in a small, wooden meeting house in a place called Salem Village, Massachusetts. This is a place where every shadow holds a new kind of fear, and a simple accusation from a young girl can become a fire that consumes an entire community. The brutality of the European trials, the fear of the Malleus Maleficarum, has crossed the Atlantic and taken on a terrifying new form. The Salem witch trials are a universal historical truth that you've probably heard about. But let's dive into the details, the specific flavour of paranoia that took root in this small Puritan community. The story begins, as many do, with a group of teenage girls. They begin to exhibit strange behaviours, fits, convulsions, uncontrollable screaming, in a world with no understanding of modern psychology or neurology. The only explanation that made sense was the supernatural. They were believed to be afflicted by witchcraft, and the girls, when pressed, began to name names. The first three people accused were a slave named Tituba, a poor woman named Sarah Good, and an elderly woman named Sarah Osborne. They were easy targets, people who were already on the margins of society and didn't fit the community's rigid mould. Tituba, in particular, was an outsider and under pressure. She began to weave a wild tale of broomstick rides, demonic rituals, and other witches in the village. Her confession, likely coerced and embellished, served as the opening act for a long and bloody drama. What makes Salem so fascinating and so horrifying is the way the panic spread. Unlike the more formalised, bureaucratic witch trials in Europe, the Salem hysteria was a grassroots movement. It was fueled by a unique mix of factors, a deep-seated Puritan belief in the devil's active presence in the world, the isolation and hardship of colonial life, and an intense web of social and economic rivalries. The community was already rife with tension and family against family, farmer against merchant. The witch trials provided a twisted supernatural outlet for these very real, very human conflicts. The concept of spectral evidence is a little known but absolutely crucial detail in understanding what happened. The accusers, primarily the young girls, claimed that they saw the spectre, or spirit, of the accused tormenting them. This was a nightmare of a legal concept. How do you defend yourself against an invisible ghost? You couldn't. The court, led by a magistrate named John Hathorne, accepted this spectral evidence as proof of guilt. A person's guilt was determined not by what they did, but by what their ghostly double was seen doing. This is a point that historians continue to debate. Why did the judges allow spectral evidence? Was it because they genuinely believed in it? Or was it because they were swept up in the hysteria and couldn't resist the pressure of the accusers and the mob? It's a key question, and the answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Salem judges were men of their time, deeply religious and fearful of the devil, but they were also men under immense public pressure, trying to maintain order in a community that was rapidly spiraling into chaos. The trials escalated with a terrifying speed. The girls, now seen as divinely inspired, were given immense power. Their accusations were gospel, and they began to point fingers at more prominent members of the community, people who had a reputation for piety and good standing. This is where the panic truly began to spin out of control, when the accusations started hitting respected figures like the former minister, Reverend George Burroughs. People began to realize that no one was safe. A peculiar detail in Reverend Burroughs' case is a good example of the absurdity. One of the accusations against him was his supposed superhuman strength. The girls claimed his spectre had given them strength, and a witness testified that he had once been able to lift a heavy gun with just one hand. This kind of evidence shows how far the trials had strayed from any semblance of reality. They were no longer about concrete actions, but about perceived malice and supernatural power. The brutality of the Salem trials, while not involving the same extensive torture as in Europe, was psychological and physical in its own way. Those accused were put in jail, often in horrific conditions, and pressured to confess. The famous case of Giles Corey is a chilling example. When he refused to enter a plea, the court subjected him to a gruesome form of torture known as peine forte et dure, where he was pressed under heavy stones until he died. His famous last words, "More weight," were a final, defiant act against the system that had already condemned him. He chose to die to save his property from being seized by the state and his family from being ruined. The trials finally came to an end in 1692. The governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, stepped in and dissolved the court. The reason the accusations had reached his own wife, and the tide of public opinion was finally beginning to turn. He ordered that spectral evidence no longer be admitted, and with this key pillar of the prosecution removed, the cases fell apart. The last hangings took place in September, and by the following spring, all remaining accused were pardoned and released. The Salem nightmare was over, but its scars would last for generations. The Salem panic has faded into history, and you're back across the Atlantic. The fear of witches, however, hasn't. It's the 16th and 17th centuries, and the witch hunts are reaching their terrifying peak in Europe. This isn't a single event in a small village. This is a continent-wide crisis, a mass delusion that sweeps from the shores of Scotland to the alpine valleys of Germany. This period is often referred to as the Great European Witch Hunt, and it's a universal historical truth that the scale of it dwarfs the Salem trials entirely. While Salem saw around 20 executions, some regions of Germany alone saw thousands. The spread of the witch hunts was a complex phenomenon, driven by a perfect storm of social, economic, and religious factors. The Protestant Reformation and the subsequent Catholic Counter-Reformation created a deeply fractured and unstable Europe. Both sides, Catholic and Protestant, accused the other of being in league with the devil. This intense religious rivalry fueled a paranoia that the devil was actively working to undermine Christendom, and that his agents, the witches, were everywhere. It's an easy jump from a theological conflict to blaming your neighbour who follows a different sect. This is a fun fact for you, one you might not know. A huge part of the witch panic was driven by a concept known as the Satanic Panic. It wasn't just about individual witches casting spells, it was about a widespread, organised conspiracy led by the devil himself. Witches were believed to gather in secret meetings called Sabbaths, where they would worship Satan, have orgies, and conspire to destroy Christian society. This idea of an organised, secret enemy gave the witch hunts a sense of urgency and legitimacy. It wasn't about catching a few isolated women. It was about fighting a war for the soul of the world. The economic hardships of the time also played a significant role. Europe was struggling with crop failures, plague, and famine. These were chaotic, frightening times, and people were desperate for answers. A witch became a convenient scapegoat for all of life's misfortunes. The idea that a witch was cursing the fields or bringing the plague was a far more palatable explanation than accepting the randomness of nature or the limitations of medical science. It gave people a target for their frustration and a sense of control over an uncontrollable world. The legal system of the time was also a major factor. The shift from a more traditional, local legal system to a more centralised, inquisitorial one meant that trials were often conducted in a much more brutal and systematic way. Judges and magistrates, armed with books like the Malleus Maleficarum, had the power to order torture to extract confessions. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. A judge who was convinced of a witch conspiracy would use torture to get a confession, and the confession would then prove the existence of the conspiracy, leading to more accusations and more trials. It was a vicious cycle of fear and violence. Historians still debate the specific triggers for the start of the burning times in different regions. Was it a local feud that got out of hand? Was it a charismatic witch hunter who stirred up a panic? Or was it a combination of all these factors? In some regions, a single powerful figure, a judge or a prince bishop, became obsessed with witch hunting, leading to a frenzy of trials. In others, the panic was more organic, growing from the ground up out of local tensions and fears. The truth is that there was no single cause, but rather a convergence of many different pressures that made Europe ripe for this kind of mass hysteria. Let's talk about the incredible misogyny at the heart of it all. As you recall from the Malleus, the belief that women were more susceptible to the devil was a foundational principle of the witch hunts. The majority of people executed were women. The witch was a woman who was too old, too independent, too rich, too poor, or simply too defiant for her community. It was a tool of social control, a way of punishing women who didn't conform to the strict patriarchal norms of the time. A crucial and often overlooked detail is how the witch trials became a source of revenue for some communities. The property of the accused, once they were found guilty, was often confiscated. In some places, this created a perverse incentive for officials to pursue trials, as they could line their own pockets and fill the coffers of the state. This financial motive added another layer of cynical calculation to an already horrifying system, turning human lives into a commodity to be exploited. And so, you see a continent gripped by a collective madness. The fear of witches wasn't just a quaint superstition, it was a deeply ingrained belief, fueled by religious extremism, economic anxiety, and social conflict. The burning times, as they are often called, were a dark chapter in European history, a period when reason and mercy were abandoned in favour of fear and superstition, and the legacy of this mass hysteria would last for centuries. A chilling reminder of what can happen when a society loses its mind. The fires of the witch hunts are burning across Europe. But let's take a step back and look at the fuel. What allowed this mass hysteria to take hold and spread with such ferocity? The answer, as you're starting to see, is complex. But one of the most powerful forces at play was religion. Both the Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations, despite their bitter rivalry, were united in their fear of the devil and their belief in witchcraft. This shared conviction provided the theological and moral justification for the persecution of thousands. The universal historical truth here is that the witch hunts were not just a random outburst of superstition. They were a deeply religious phenomenon. The church, in its various forms, was the primary institution that sanctioned and often led the persecution. The witch was not just a person who used magic. She was an apostate, a heretic, someone who had made a literal pact with Satan to renounce God. This made her a spiritual enemy, and the fight against her was seen as a holy war. Let's dive into the specifics, starting with the Catholic Church. For a long time, the Church had been skeptical of the idea of witchcraft, the official position. Dating back to the 9th century canon Episcopi, was that belief in witches and their magical flights was a delusion, a trick of the devil. But this changed. Over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, a new theological perspective emerged, one that saw witchcraft as a real and present danger. This shift was solidified with the publication of papal bulls, like Pope Innocent Novatus Summis Desiderantes Affectibus in 1484, which gave official sanction to the inquisitors to root out and prosecute witches. This is a little known but crucial detail. The witch hunts went from being a local, popular fear to a state-sanctioned, institutionalized campaign. This new papal bull was the green light for men like Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger to write the Malleus Maleficarum. The book wasn't just some crackpot theory, it was a text that had the official backing of the highest office in the Catholic Church. It provided the intellectual and theological framework for the trials, giving priests and judges a divine mandate to torture and kill. On the other side of the Reformation, the Protestant churches were no less zealous. In fact, in many places, they were even more brutal. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, while railing against the superstition of the Catholic Church, were equally convinced of the reality of witchcraft. They saw the devil as a powerful, active force in the world, and they believed that witches were his earthly servants. For them, a witch was a direct threat to the Protestant vision of a godly society, and she had to be eliminated. This is a point that historians continue to debate. Why did Protestant areas, which were supposed to be less superstitious and more focused on individual piety, often have some of the most intense witch hunts? Some argue that the Protestant emphasis on a direct, personal relationship with God, and the belief that the devil was constantly trying to corrupt that relationship, made them particularly susceptible to a fear of witchcraft. Others point to the fact that Protestant states were often more centralized and had a more efficient legal system, which allowed for the mass prosecution of witches. A fun fact to highlight the depth of this belief is that the witch hunters in both Catholic and Protestant areas often saw themselves as martyrs, fighting a holy war against a very real enemy. They believed they were protecting their communities and their faith from a demonic invasion. This sense of divine purpose, as you can imagine, gave them a horrifying sense of righteousness, making it easier for them to justify the most extreme forms of torture and violence. The witch trials, therefore, were not just a historical event, they were a theological statement. They were a violent expression of a world that was deeply afraid of evil and deeply convinced that evil took a human form. The witch, the agent of the devil, was the perfect scapegoat for all the religious, social, and economic anxieties of the time. The Church, both Catholic and Protestant, gave people the vocabulary to express their fears and the legal and moral authority to act on them. So, as you're drifting off, remember this: the flames of the pyres were stoked not just by fear and ignorance, but by a powerful, deeply held religious conviction. It's a chilling reminder of how belief, when taken to its most extreme and literal form, can justify unimaginable cruelty. The fires of the witch hunts are still burning, but as the 17th century draws to a close and the 18th century begins, a new kind of chill is in the air, the cold, clear light of reason. The great European witch panic, which had consumed so much of the continent for so long, is beginning to wane. This isn't a sudden stop, but a slow, gradual decline, a fizzle rather than a bang. You are witnessing a monumental shift in human thought, where the old certainties of superstition and religious dogma are being challenged by new ideas about science, law, and human nature. The universal historical truth you're now seeing is that the end of the witch trials was not due to a single event or a change in religious doctrine, but rather a combination of factors that chipped away at the foundation of the hunts. The most significant of these was the rise of scientific rationalism and the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton were demonstrating that the world operated on predictable, natural laws, not on the whims of demons or witches. A bad harvest was not the work of a curse, it was the result of poor soil, bad weather, or pests. A sick child wasn't bewitched. They were ill with a disease that could be studied and, hopefully, cured. This new way of thinking made the entire premise of witchcraft seem less and less plausible, a fascinating and little known detail in this shift was the role of lawyers and judges. Many of them, educated in the new humanistic tradition, began to question the legal basis of the trials. They saw the flaws in the system, the use of coerced confessions, the acceptance of flimsy spectral evidence, and the lack of a proper defence for the accused. They started demanding higher standards of proof. The torture that had been so central to the trials was now being viewed as unreliable and inhumane, as more and more judges threw out cases or acquitted the accused. The legal machinery of the witch hunt began to grind to a halt. This is a point that historians continue to debate. Was the decline of the witch hunts a top-down process, driven by the intellectual elite, or a bottom-up process, driven by popular skepticism? The truth is likely a mix of both. As the legal system became more skeptical, public opinion slowly began to turn as well. People who had once been quick to accuse their neighbours were now more hesitant, fearing that they themselves might be next, or simply feeling a growing sense of unease about the brutality of the trials, the sheer scale of the executions. In some places, became so overwhelming that people began to doubt whether so many of their neighbours could truly be in league with the devil. An interesting point to consider is how the witch hunts simply became too expensive and too disruptive. The constant accusations and trials were tearing communities apart. It was economically devastating to have so many people in jail and on trial. In some places, the government itself began to lose faith in the system, seeing it as a source of instability rather than a tool for social control. This practical, financial reality was just as important as the intellectual and legal shifts in bringing an end to the era. As the Enlightenment took hold, the idea of a personal, active devil became less central to religious thought. The focus shifted from fear of a demonic conspiracy to a more abstract, benevolent God who governed the universe through natural laws. This change in theology removed the moral and religious justification for the trials. Without the backing of the church and the fear of a real, tangible devil, the entire concept of a witch hunt lost its power. The final official execution for witchcraft in Europe is a poignant and often cited example of this turning tide. In 1782, a woman named Anna Goldie was executed in Switzerland. Her case, however, was a travesty of justice, and it was widely condemned by the European press as a barbaric anachronism. Her execution served as a wake-up call, a final, shameful act that solidified public and intellectual opinion against the witch hunts. After Anna Goldie, the era was truly over. The flames of the pyres have long since been extinguished, but the shadows they cast are still with us. You're now in the modern world, looking back at the centuries of fear and persecution. The witch hunts are over, but the legacy of the witch trials is a profound and lasting one, a dark thread woven into the fabric of our legal systems, our social norms, and our collective memory. The brutal truth of those centuries isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a cautionary tale with lessons that are still relevant today. The most enduring legacy is perhaps in our legal system, the witch trials, with their use of coerced confessions, spectral evidence, and the presumption of guilt, are a perfect example of what a legal system should not be. The abuses of that era, particularly the use of torture to extract confessions, led to a greater emphasis on due process and the rights of the accused. The idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty and has the right to a fair trial with a proper defence are principles that were forged in the crucible of these brutal historical events. The memory of the witch trials serves as a constant reminder of the dangers of letting fear and prejudice dictate the course of justice. A little known but fascinating detail is how the witch trials influenced our modern concept of evidence. The absurdity of spectral evidence and the unreliability of confessions extracted under torture forced a re-evaluation of what constitutes credible proof. Jurists and thinkers who came after the burning times began to demand tangible, verifiable evidence. The shift away from superstition and toward a more empirical standard of proof is a direct result of the legal failures of the witch trials. The witch trials also left an indelible mark on our understanding of gender and power. The fact that the vast majority of people executed were women is not a coincidence. The witch hunts were, at their core, a deeply misogynistic phenomenon. They were a way of punishing women who stepped outside the narrow confines of what was considered acceptable behaviour. The witch was a powerful, independent, and often defiant woman, the antithesis of the patriarchal ideal. The legacy of this is still with us in subtle ways. The image of the witch as a wicked, old hag is a stereotype that has its roots in this era of persecution. It is a chilling reminder of how society has historically punished and demonized female power. Historians still debate the specific long-term psychological effects of the witch hunts on European society. Did the fear of witches and the brutal methods used to eradicate them create a lasting culture of suspicion and conformity? Or did the eventual rejection of the trials lead to a greater emphasis on individual rights and freedom of thought? The answer is likely a complex mix of both. The witch hunts were a traumatic event, and their memory, however distorted, has shaped our collective consciousness in ways we are still trying to understand. The legacy of the witch trials is a profound one. It is in the presumption of innocence that is a cornerstone of our legal system. It is in the demand for evidence and the rejection of superstition. And it is in the chilling reminder that a society, when gripped by fear and prejudice, can turn on itself with a terrifying and brutal efficiency. The stories of the accused, the tortured, and the executed are not just tales of a bygone era. They are a permanent part of our history, a warning from the past that we would be foolish to ignore. The centuries of fear, torture, and fire have passed. The whispers of witchcraft are now just echoes in dusty history books. But the archetype of the witch, the powerful, often misunderstood woman didn't disappear. It transformed. You're now living in an era where the witch has been reclaimed, reinterpreted, and reimagined, shedding her terrifying past to become a symbol of female empowerment, rebellion, and spiritual connection to the natural world. The universal historical truth here is that the modern witch is a far cry from her medieval predecessor. She isn't a demon-worshipping apostate, but often a practitioner of a modern, nature-based spirituality. Think of movements like Wicca, a contemporary pagan religion founded in the mid-20th century, which sees witchcraft not as a tool of evil, but as a way to connect with the divine, respect the earth, and live in harmony with the cycles of nature. The modern witch is a healer, a protector, and a spiritual guide, a far more benign and often positive figure than the one burned at the stake. A fascinating and little known detail is how much of this reclamation was driven by popular culture in the 20th century. The witch began to appear in movies and TV shows, not as a villain to be feared, but as a hero to be admired. Think of the kind, benevolent witch of The Wizard of Oz, or the magical teenagers of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. These portrayals began to chip away at the old, sinister stereotypes, replacing them with images of magic as a source of good, and witches as misunderstood but ultimately moral characters. This shift in media was a powerful force in changing public perception. This is a point that historians and sociologists continue to debate. To what extent did this cultural reclamation truly erase the historical trauma of the witch hunts? While the modern witch is a symbol of empowerment, the historical witch was a victim of immense violence and misogyny. The two are inextricably linked. The modern embrace of the witch as a feminist icon is a powerful act of defiance, a way of taking a symbol of patriarchal oppression and turning it into a symbol of strength. It's a way of saying, you tried to destroy us, but we're still here, and we're stronger than ever. The modern witch also represents a growing interest in alternative spiritualities and a rejection of traditional religious institutions. For many, modern witchcraft is a way of finding a personal, meaningful connection to the world outside of the rigid dogma that sanctioned the witch hunts in the first place. It is a form of spiritual rebellion, a way of healing the wounds left by centuries of religious violence. The witch, in this sense, has come full circle, from being the ultimate enemy of the church to becoming a symbol of liberation from its historical grip.